So I'm very happy that Root Institute has invited me to give a talk on this auspicious day, which is called Wheel Turning Day. It celebrates the day on which the Buddha gave his very first teaching and set in motion the wheel of Dharma. So it's very auspicious for us. And it's also said that any virtue, any merit that we create on this day is multiplied by, I think, 10 million or 100 million, lots. So it's a good day to do good deeds and create this merit and then dedicate that merit to the attainment of Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. So this activity that we're doing now of this talk is also a virtuous activity. So to make sure that it really is as virtuous and positive as possible, let's take a few minutes to generate a really positive motivation, especially the motivation of bodhicitta, altruism. This is the best state of mind we can have for listening to this talk. So take a few minutes or moments to settle down. In case you've been busy running around doing other things just before this talk, so your mind may be a little agitated. So just sit quietly, relax your body. It's helpful to be aware of the breathing coming in and going out. That helps settle our body and our mind and be more in the present. So just for a few moments, pay attention to your breathing. Allow your breath to flow in and out in a natural way. And put aside any thoughts there may be in your mind. There may be thoughts left over from things you were doing earlier today before this talk. Or you may have thoughts of what you're going to do afterwards, tonight or tomorrow, or any time in the future. So let go of the past and the future. Let go of thoughts of other people, other places, other activities. So put all those thoughts aside for now and just let your mind rest in the present moment, the here and now. And now let's take a few more moments to bring into our mind a positive motivation for being part of this talk. So the very best motivation that we can have is bodhicitta, the altruistic wish to benefit all living beings in the best possible way, and to be able to fulfill that wish, aspiring to become a fully enlightened Buddha, to follow in the Buddha's footsteps and become fully enlightened, just as he did, because that's the best way that we can help all other living beings. Will have unlimited knowledge and abilities and compassion and love and everything possible to be able to help every other living being be free of suffering and reach enlightenment as well. So if you're familiar with that state of mind, that attitude of bodhicitta, you can bring that in as your reason, your motivation for listening to this talk. And if you're not so familiar or comfortable with that idea, you may feel you're not sure if there is such a thing as enlightenment, not sure if you are able to achieve it. So that's fine. It does take time to learn about bodhicitta and enlightenment and get comfortable with that kind of motivation. So if you're not at that point, that's fine. But try to at least feel the wish to benefit others. We all do feel that way, at least sometimes. We recognize that there's a lot of suffering in the world, a lot of suffering around us, and we feel how nice it would be if that suffering could come to an end, and if we could help others have less suffering and more happiness. So we all have that feeling sometimes of wanting to benefit others. So bring that thought or feeling or attitude into your mind and connect it with what we're doing here now. Have the wish, the aspiration that you'll learn something from this talk that will help you to be more beneficial to others and to the world. Okay, so hopefully there'll be some time to do some more meditation later. So it's been almost 2 months since we celebrated the anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment. And that's also said to be the day that he was born and the day he passed away. And that day is known as Wesak in Southeast Asia. In Tibetan, they call it Sakadawa. So that was a couple of months ago. And so what did the Buddha do after he attained enlightenment? Did he start teaching right away? So the story is that, first of all, the Buddha attained enlightenment while sitting under the Bodhi tree in this place, which is now called Bodhgaya in Bihar state. So I hope everyone's had the chance to visit that wonderful place. And so that's where he attained enlightenment. And he didn't start teaching right away, right after his attainment of enlightenment. So after having that amazing experience of his mind completely transforming into enlightened mind, he remained in the area of the Bodhi tree for another 7 weeks. And during that time, he continued to reflect on and meditate on what he had realized on the night of his awakening. In particular, he thought about the causes of suffering. He went through the 12 links. So this is an explanation in Buddhism that kind of breaks down the actual procedure for how we create suffering for ourselves, how we take rebirth in cyclic existence again and again and again. That's a very important topic, the 12 links of dependent origination. So the Buddha continued contemplating those, how those 12 links are the cause of suffering, and also how it's possible to overcome and eliminate the causes of suffering by going in kind of reverse order. If you eliminate this one, then you eliminate that one, and so on and so forth. So he contemplated these kind of points, or these things that he had realized that enabled him to reach enlightenment. And he did think about teaching and sharing what he had realized with other people, other beings. But then he thought, this is just too subtle for people to understand, because it's beyond concept, beyond thought. And he thought, worldly people in the world are so caught up in attachment. They're so used to living with lust and aggression, and they have too much dust in their eyes that they wouldn't be able to understand the truth of things that he had realized. And so this is what came into his mind. And then the story is that there was one god, one deva, by the name of Sahampati, who had clairvoyance and was able to know what the Buddha thought in his mind. He understood the Buddha decided not to teach because nobody would understand it. And this god came down from his abode. He lived in the heavenly realm of the Brahma gods. And he approached the Buddha and requested the Buddha to turn the wheel of Dharma. He said that there were many people who were genuine seekers of the truth and had only a little dust in their eyes. And he said that if the Buddha were to teach the Dharma, it would liberate countless beings from the cycle of existence. So the Buddha was filled with compassion after hearing these words. Although, of course, the Buddha's mind had compassion anyway. Buddha's mind is always full of compassion. But he didn't say anything immediately. He remained silent, and this god, Sahampati, returned to his heavenly abode. And later, two wealthy merchants were passing through this area, and they happened to see the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree and were struck by his appearance. He appeared very radiant, very kind of magnificent. And they went up and offered him some food. And the Buddha spoke a few words to these men. And then they prostrated themselves to the Buddha and declared that they took refuge in the Buddha and in the Dharma, the Buddha's teachings. So at that point in time, there wasn't yet the Sangha. So there were only two jewels, two objects of refuge. And so they took refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma. So they became the first Buddhist refugees, the first people to take refuge in the Buddha and declare themselves followers of the Buddha. So then they left, and the Buddha ate the food that they gave him. So this was the first food he had eaten in 49 days since his attainment of enlightenment. And then thought about teaching and wondered who could he teach, who would be able to understand these amazing truths that he had realized. And he first thought of his previous teachers. There were two teachers he had studied with, Arada Kalama and Rudraka Ramaputra. And he thought that they might be able to understand what he had to say. But then with his divine eye, this is like a clairvoyant ability to see things in the world and in the universe and so on. So he saw that they had already passed away. They were no longer in the world. And then he thought of his 5 companions. There were these 5 practitioners that he had spent time with, meditating and doing ascetic practices. And he thought they might be able to understand what I have to say. And he saw that they were staying at Deer Park near Varanasi. And so he decided to go there. And it took him several days to walk from Bodhgaya to that place. And so these 5 men were there in the Deer Park, and they saw the Buddha coming. And at first, they decided among themselves that they would just ignore him, because they thought that he had abandoned the true path. He had given up the ascetic practices that he had been doing previously and that they were still doing. And so they thought, oh, he's gone soft. He's gone off the path and became very self-indulgent. So they first were going to just ignore him. But then as he got closer, they noticed that he looked different. He appeared quite radiant and magnificent. And so just spontaneously, as he got closer to where they were, they stood up and greeted him respectfully, and then made a seat for him and asked him to sit down, and they brought him water. And the Buddha started talking to them. He told them that he had attained the unborn, the deathless. And if they were to practice his instructions, then they could attain this as well. So at first they were skeptical, because they still had this thought, no, he's given up the path, he's given up the ascetic life, which they believed was very important, and had become like self-indulgent. He'd eaten some rich food. So after some time, they finally agreed that they would listen to what the Buddha had to say. And then the Buddha proceeded to give his first teaching. So this first teaching given by the Buddha is a sutra called Dhamma Chakra. I don't know how to say it properly. Dhamma Chakra Pavatana Sutra. And I thought to read, it's not very long, but I'll just read part of it. I won't read the whole thing, but you can download the whole sutra. It's from the Pali Canon, translated from the Pali by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So you're welcome to get this sutra. And I just thought it's auspicious to read it today. This is the day when this sutra was first taught, more than 2,500 years ago. Okay, so it says, "Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5 thus: Bhikkhus, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana." So in that paragraph, the Buddha is talking about two extreme ways of practicing or living your life, we could say. So one is pursuing sensual pleasures, so just running after the pleasures of the senses, beautiful objects to look at, beautiful sounds to listen to, smells, tastes, tactile sensations. So most people in the world, that's where they're at. Everyone, or most people, I should say, are just trying to enjoy themselves as much as possible. Yeah, with looking at beautiful things and listening to beautiful sounds like beautiful music and smelling fragrant odors like perfume. People love to douse themselves with perfume, with fragrance. And it's very difficult even to buy products like, soaps and shampoos and so on that aren't full of fragrance. In the monastery where I live, there's one person, one resident, who's highly allergic to fragrance of any kind. And so when people come here with fragrance, we don't use anything with fragrance here, but sometimes visitors come and mostly they have fragrance on their bodies, and this person gets really sick immediately. so it's good to be aware of that. It's good to be aware that there are people who are highly sensitive and get very ill if they smell any kind of perfume or fragrance. So anyway, but most people love it. They love nice smells. And then tastes. So we love delicious foods and drinks and spend quite a bit of our time enjoying. And I think that was one of the big sufferings that people had during the pandemic, not being able to go out and eat in restaurants and in their coffee shops and enjoy all these delicious foods and so on. They just had to cook at home. And well, I guess some places were delivering food to their homes, but still, yeah, people generally loved eating nice food. And then with our bodies, we love pleasant experiences, nice soft clothing, and of course, sexual pleasure. That's probably the biggest attachment that people have, the bliss of sexual union, orgasm, and having a massage. And many people in the West, they love going swimming. They love going to the beach and lying in the sun and then swimming in the ocean. So these are just examples of sensory pleasures we experience with our bodies. So a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money is spent by human beings trying to achieve these sensual pleasures. And so the Buddha is saying this is one extreme. Just trying to experience as much sensual pleasure as possible. But he said, this is low, this is vulgar, this is the way of worldlings, ignoble and unbeneficial. So he himself had that experience in the early part of his life, being born. I mean, he's sometimes referred to as a prince. His father was a ruler of a local area in India. And so he grew up surrounded by, all the delights, all the pleasures that were available at that time. So he certainly had plenty of experience of sensual pleasures. And then so that's one extreme. And the other extreme is self-mortification. And so that's like the opposite. That's not allowing yourself to have any kind of sensual pleasures, and sometimes even causing yourself physical pain. So it was common at the Buddha's time, and I guess it still happens today, that some religious practitioners, spiritual practitioners in India, follow this path. And for example, I don't know if anyone still does this, but there's this one practice they call the 5 fires, where a person will sit in the middle of 4 fires. There's, an east, northeast, south, and west, like a bonfire burning. They sit in the middle of that. And then the 5th fire is the sun. So, out in the middle of the day, under the hot sun, with these 4 fires around you. So, so this was believed to be a practice that would enable you to overcome your attachments and your afflictions and attain nirvana. Okay, so the Buddha himself, as you probably know, spent many years living a very strict ascetic life and hardly eating anything. They say he ate just 1 grain of rice a day. His body became just like a skeleton. He almost died. And not sleeping, just sitting up all night and just being out in the open, no roof over the head. So whatever, rain or maybe not snow, maybe didn't snow in that place, but wind and insects and animals and so on. Just completely exposed to all these difficult experiences. So that's the other extreme, is kind of not really taking care of yourself and even allowing yourself or causing yourself to have a lot of physical discomfort or pain. So he says that's not the way either. He said that is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. So he found that way of life just wasn't helping. It wasn't enabling him to achieve the state that he was looking for. And so he's saying avoid those two extremes and follow the middle way. So that's what he did. He awakened to the middle way. And this is what gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. And then he goes on to say, what is this middle way? And here he explains the what's called the Noble Eightfold Path, the Eightfold Path. So he says, and what bhikkhus is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision and so on and so forth, which leads to nirvana? It is this noble eightfold path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. I'll go through these 8 points because they're not normally explained so much in the Tibetan tradition, but they are in the Theravada tradition. So there's some information about that and ways we can start practicing. So we can start practicing these now in our life. So I'll explain more about that later. Okay, so then after mentioning these 8 points of the Eightfold Path, the Buddha went on to explain the Four Noble Truths, or Four Truths of the Aryas, which is a really central teaching in the whole of the Buddha Dharma. Okay, so I'll read his words. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. So in this passage, he mentions 8 examples or 8 types of suffering. And these are actually in the Lam Rim. If you're familiar with the Lam Rim, the graduated path to enlightenment. So in the Lam Rim, there's 3 main sections. The first is called the small scope, second is the middle scope, and the third is the great scope. So in the middle scope, that's the section that concerns cultivating what we call renunciation, or the determination to be free from samsara, from cyclic existence. And that actually is an expansion of the Four Noble Truths, meditating on the Four Noble Truths and the first truth of suffering. And so in the Lamrim, there's many different lists of different kinds of sufferings, such as the 6 sufferings, the 8 sufferings, the 3 sufferings. Those are kind of more or less general sufferings of samsara. And then there's each realm, each of the 6 realms has its own specific kinds of suffering. So anyway, there's all these lists of different kinds of sufferings, different kinds of problems we experience in samsara. And we need to contemplate these so that we really come to see that samsara, cyclic existence, is completely undesirable, it's bad, it's a horrible place to be, so that we generate the wish to get out. Because if we think samsara is nice, it's wonderful, then we don't have the strong determination to do what we need to do to get ourselves out. Although, when things are bad, like when we're sick or something bad is happening to someone we care about, or like during the pandemic, all kinds of problems were experienced and are still being experienced. So when there's lots of bad things, problems in the world, then it's easy to think, oh yeah, samsara is terrible. Samsara sucks. I want to get out. But then when we're having a good time, things are going well, we're having a love affair with somebody, or we're eating in a wonderful restaurant and the whole atmosphere is just beautiful and the food is beautiful and there's beautiful music. So when we're in the midst of some pleasant experience, then we kind of forget about the painful aspects of samsara, and we may feel, oh, samsara is not so bad. It's quite nice. I'm not sure I want to get out of this. Yeah. So it's not so easy to really understand, even to understand what samsara is. That's quite difficult because it isn't a place. It isn't like this world, this planet is samsara and nirvana is somewhere up in space. But rather, samsara is this body-mind situation that we have, our very body and mind, our very being. This is samsara. And why it's so unpleasant and something we need to free ourselves from is because this body and mind situation came about because of karma and afflictions, faulty causes, especially ignorance of the true nature of things, and then other afflictions like attachment, aversion, jealousy, and so forth, and the karma that we created under the influence of these afflictive emotions. So the very causes for our existence, for our life, are faulty, are imperfect, are tainted, polluted. And so since the causes are polluted, then our whole being, our body and mind are polluted, are contaminated, which is actually what it says here. Well, not so clear, but the eighth type of suffering mentioned here, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. So that's referring to our body and mind, this body-mind situation, which came about because of faulty causes, one of which is clinging or craving, strong attachment. So just having this body-mind situation, which came about as a result of faulty causes, imperfect causes, and then while we're living, while we're existing, we experience various kinds of problems again and again. And also we continue to have ignorance and attachment and aversion, and we create karma. And so we're continuously creating the causes for more of this same experience. We're kind of perpetuating our situation in samsara, not deliberately, consciously. Most people have no idea what they're doing, but the Buddha points out we are creating the causes to suffer again and again and again every single day in ignorance, because we don't understand how things are. So this very situation that we are in, this is samsara, and we need to recognize that it's very imperfect, it's very unsatisfactory, and it's something we want to get out of and not continue to be in. So he points out these 8 different kinds of sufferings, like being born and then getting sick, getting old and dying, not getting what we want, meeting with what we don't want, losing and separating from what we want to hang on to. And that can be people, that's probably our biggest object of attachment is other people. Mother and father and brothers and sisters. And then if you get married, you have your spouse and your children, and we have our friends. So we don't want to separate from these people. We want them to be there forever. And that's just not possible. Nobody lasts forever. Everyone is subject to death. And so that's probably one of the biggest sufferings of human beings is losing a loved one. We all know that. We've all been through that. And we continue going through that again and again, all through our life and from one life to another, separating from loved ones and also from property, possessions that we want to hang on to, we want to keep with us, but we can't. They break, or they fall apart, or they're stolen or lost. So we have to separate from these. And then when we die, we have to separate from everyone and everything. We can't take any of our possessions and our loved ones with us. And that's a huge suffering, separation from what we don't want to separate from, what we want to stay close to, cling to forever and ever and ever, but it's not possible. So these are some of those experiences we go through again and again and again, not just once, in one lifetime, but again and again and again, life after life after life after life. So Buddha is trying to point this out and say, look at this situation you are in. It's terrible. It's awful. You've got to get yourself out of it. So that's the first noble truth. And then the second one, he says, now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Oh, sorry, I skipped over the second one. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering, or the causes of suffering. So why do we have suffering? Where does it come from? He says, it is this craving which leads to re-becoming, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. So here the Buddha mentions craving as the cause of suffering, which it is. I mean, craving is a kind of attachment, a strong kind of attachment. So I think we can all see how attachment keeps us in a state of suffering. We're attached to our bodies, we're attached to pleasure, we're attached to people, to money, to things, and want to hold on to these things forever, want to have them more and more of them all the time. We get greedy and aren't satisfied with what we have, but we want more and more and better and better. So it's easy to see how attachment leads to suffering. But there are other causes of suffering as well, such as anger, hatred. That's another huge cause of suffering. And ignorance. Ignorance is the main cause of suffering. Not knowing the true nature of things, the reality of things. Thinking there's a real, inherently existing I and real, inherently existing other people and things. So seeing everything as inherently or independently existing, which in fact isn't true. Nothing exists that way. So we see everything in a faulty way, in a mistaken way. So we're like in a state of confusion all the time. And that's the root cause of suffering. Because in this state of confusion, we're like blind and we're grasping for pleasure. So we get attached to people and things and want more and more of those. And we have aversion to anyone and anything that is unpleasant to us. And then we sometimes get very aggressive and do harmful things, create negative karma. So all of this is because of ignorance, not knowing the true nature of things. So these are the main causes of suffering. The main causes of suffering explained in the Tibetan tradition are afflictive emotions, afflictive states of mind, greed, hatred, ignorance, and also karma. the actions we do under their influence. And yeah, so afflictions and karma, those are the main cause of suffering. But the good news is that it's possible to overcome them. They are not permanent things that will exist forever. So the third noble truth, explained by the Buddha, is called the cessation of suffering. So here the Buddha said, now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance of it. So here he's talking about how it's possible to be free of craving, but the same is true for all the other afflictive emotions, ignorance, hatred, aversion, and so on. So all the afflictive emotions, they're not permanent aspects of our mind. They're not things that will be in our mind forever and ever and cannot be extracted from our mind, but they are more like, a good example is pollution or contamination that gets into water. The water, the real nature of water, especially your water that comes from deep in the ground from a spring, that kind of water is very pure and healthy. We can drink it. We don't have to, purify it in any way. It's very healthy water, like Evian water, or these wonderful waters that come from Switzerland and France and so on. You pay a lot of money to have one bottle of this water. But yeah, this is like really naturally pure. That's the real state of water. But sometimes water gets polluted, especially by human activity. Chemicals and detergents and so on. So sometimes, that stuff gets into the water and then it becomes polluted, contaminated, and it's not healthy to drink. If you drink it, you'll get sick. So, but that pollution, that contamination in the water isn't part of the water. It isn't the natural part of water. And it's not something that will stay in water permanently forever. It's possible to purify water. So there's different kinds of systems to filter water and remove all the pollution. And then, the end product is, again, completely pure, clean, healthy water that you can drink without getting sick. So it's similar with our mind. The true nature of our mind is said to be pure and uncontaminated with afflictive emotions. So the afflictive emotions like craving and aversion, hatred, ignorance, and so on, these are like contamination in our mind. They're not permanent, fixed parts of our mind, but can be removed, can be taken out, and then the mind restored to, its natural, pure state. So this is the meaning of cessation. Cessation is when you're able to remove or extract the afflictions in the mind. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's not like all the pollution goes away in one go, but it's a gradual process. So you first remove the more gross forms of the afflictions, and then subtler ones. And finally, you're able to get rid of the most subtle afflictions or obscurations in the mind. And that's when the mind is able to reach enlightenment, Buddhahood. So it's by removing these afflictions and obscurations in the mind. And so that's the meaning of cessation. It's purifying the mind, cleaning out the mind, getting rid of all the causes of suffering. So Buddha discovered that that's possible. It's doable. He did it. And other people can do it as well. So that's the meaning of the third truth, cessation. And then the fourth truth is sometimes it's called the path. In this translation, it's called the way. So the Buddha says, now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path. So again, he's mentioning the eightfold path as the way, the path to eliminate suffering and reach the cessation of suffering, peace, nirvana. So that, again, the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Okay, so just in those few paragraphs, the Buddha set out the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Okay, so that's kind of the essence of his teachings. And I'll just kind of mention the rest of the sutra without reading it. The Buddha went on to say that when the knowledge and the vision of the Four Truths was thoroughly purified in himself, he awakened to unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. And when he gave this teaching, one of the five one of the five men who then became his disciples, a man named by the name of Kondana, he gained stainless vision of the Dharma. So he kind of got it right away. He realized what the Buddha was talking about. And the other four, in the coming days, as they spent more time with the Buddha and listened to his teachings, then they also gained this realization. So they all became arhats. That's the name of a person who has attained nirvana. And then after the Buddha finished his teaching, it says the earth devas, earth gods, kind of raised a cry, rejoicing that the wheel of Dharma was set in motion by the Buddha, the Blessed One. And then the devas and the higher realms heard about this and passed on the message. So it kind of went higher and higher through the deva realms, and all the devas up to the Brahma world were rejoicing, were very ecstatic that the wheel of Dharma had been set in motion. So they all rejoiced. So that's kind of basically what is included in this first teaching that the Buddha gave on this day so many centuries ago. And so let's just look at how we can use these teachings in our daily life, how we can make them practical for us. So the Four Noble Truths, they can be understood at many different levels, down to very deep, very profound levels. So it's always good to hear about them and think about them and meditate on them again and again and again. There's always more to learn about the Four Noble Truths. But in our daily life, when we run into problems, for example, if we get sick, or even if we just have a headache or an ache or a pain in our body, a feeling of hunger or thirst or heat or cold, so even small discomforts in our body or in our mind, if we feel kind of bored or restless or unhappy or hurt or lonely or whatever kind of mental or emotional discomfort we have, or when we become aware of other people suffering, the problems that they have, we can remind ourselves, this is the first noble truth. This is the first truth that the Buddha taught, the truth of suffering. It simply means that suffering exists, problems exist. Everybody has them, not just some people. It's easy to recognize with people who are poor or sick, homeless, hungry. But when it comes to like the billionaires and the millionaires, the people who live in these huge mansions and have private planes and yachts, and you know, we might think, oh, they don't have any suffering, they don't have any problems, they have such an easy life. But that's not true. They have problems too. For example, I mean, just they have a human body, and just having a human body means you have suffering. Bodies get old, they lose their beauty, they lose health. Even if you have lots of money, that's not going to stop you from getting sick. You can still get sick. Maybe you can go to the best hospitals and get the best medical care, but you still have suffering. The physical discomfort of suffering from sickness. And also emotional problems, they have their depression and their hurts and frustrations, and they don't always get what they want, and they sometimes meet with what they don't want. I once met a very wealthy man. He told me I think he was a millionaire, and he told me about these problems he had in his life. He had a business, and the business was doing very well, but one of his employees had tried to steal some money from the company. And he said he had so much anger. He was so angry at this employee, he sometimes thought of murdering him. So, I mean, that's pretty painful to have thoughts of wanting to kill somebody. And he was involved in a court case with this person, which also, that's not a pleasant thing to have to go through. And probably his biggest suffering was his children. He had 2 children, and one child, who was a teenage girl, had some mental illness and I think schizophrenia. And she would sometimes try to commit suicide and sometimes cut herself. So I think that was his biggest cause of suffering, just seeing his daughter suffer and not being able to, she was able to get the best treatment. But internally, she still had this terrible suffering. So that must have made him suffer very much. And the other child he had was a boy who had Down syndrome, I think. So that must have caused him suffering as well, that his son would never be able to become a fully developed, fully functioning person in society. And he had a wife who also had schizophrenia, and they were separated. And so he had lots of problems. And he couldn't sleep at night. He suffered from depression. He suffered from sleeplessness. He had to take a lot of medication. So even though he had lots of money and a very comfortable life and very successful, but, a lot of suffering. So we shouldn't have the illusion that rich people, wealthy people, people who are up on the top of society, or royal people, or presidents, prime ministers, they have it good. They don't have any problems. They have suffering too. So that helps us to not feel we are the only ones who have suffering. And also it helps us to have compassion. Everybody deserves compassion. Everybody is a worthy object of our compassion because everybody has suffering. So it's good to keep that in mind. The truth of suffering, it's everywhere. It's all around us. Every ordinary being, everyone who hasn't reached enlightenment or nirvana has problems and suffering. And then we can remind ourselves of the causes of suffering, that they are the afflictions in our mind: ignorance, attachment, aversion, and the actions or karma we do under the influence of these. And this is true for ourselves, it's true for everyone else as well. And so we really need to try not to create more causes of suffering as much as we can. Try to avoid creating bad karma. Try to avoid perpetuating your afflictive emotions, and work on decreasing them. There's lots of methods we can use to decrease our afflictive emotions and gradually overcome them. So work on that. And And then there's a solution. There is a state, the third noble truth, a cessation of suffering. It is possible for every single person, every single being, to be free of suffering and the causes of suffering forever. The state of nirvana, which is perfect peace and happiness. And we can also go further and attain the state of Buddhahood, full enlightenment. And there's a way to do this. That's the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And that's what was taught by the Buddha. So in the sutra, as we can see, the Buddha mentioned the eightfold path. So let's go through those 8 points and try to understand them better and look at how we can start practicing them. Some of them may be hard for us to practice right now, but we can certainly practice some of them. So we do what we can now, and then gradually increase our ability to practice more and more. Okay, so the first of the eightfold path, here in this sutra, it's called right view. In some other translations, it's called right understanding. So right view or right understanding means we need to understand the Buddha's teachings. For example, the Four Noble Truths and so forth. So what we can do is just try to learn as much as we can. There's, especially now, there's so many online teachings and courses that you can follow and lots of books. When I first started out in the early 1970s, there was very, very little information available on Buddhism in English. Only a couple of books, very small number of books, and not many places where you could go and learn Buddhism. I traveled all the way to India, and I went to the Tibetan library in Dharamsala, and that's where I started learning. But in the West, it was very difficult to find any place where you could learn Buddhism. But now Buddhism is booming. There's so many places where you can go and study, and also you don't even have to go and study in those places with internet. You know, we can go online, and there's courses that we can follow with really excellent teachers, and then materials, so many materials available, so many texts have now been translated into English, and there's more being translated all the time. And not just English, but many other languages, European languages, and of course Hindi and Japanese and Chinese and so on. So almost all the languages have materials available where people can learn about the Buddha's teaching. So it's really wonderful now. So we should make use of these opportunities and just try to familiarize ourselves as much as we can with what the Buddha taught. There's a lot. I mean, the Buddha taught for 45 years after he became enlightened. And so the Buddha's own words, there's a big stack. You can see them in the Tibetan gompas, the Tibetan meditation halls. They usually have all the texts containing the Buddha's words, and there's 108 volumes. That's just the Buddha's words. And then on top of that, there are the Indian commentaries. So the great Buddhist masters like Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and Aryadeva and Dharmakirti and so on, these great, what the Dalai Lama calls the Nalanda masters. So they wrote commentaries to the Buddha's words. So there's, I forget how many, 200 something commentaries. And then the Tibetans also wrote commentaries like Lama Tsong Khapa. So there's a huge amount of material available to study. But we just do what we can. We learn as much as we can, even if we can't learn all of it. So that's the first of the Eightfold Path, is learning so that we have the right knowledge, the right understanding of the Buddha's teachings and of the path, what we need to do to free ourselves from samsara and reach nirvana and enlightenment. And what we do need to learn and practice can be summarized into two things. So this is kind of summarizing the practice, because it's not enough just to learn the Buddha's teachings. We need to practice them. That's the whole point, not just to have all this knowledge in our heads and be like a professor who can, spout all this information. But the whole point is to practice it, to put it into practice. So that's really important. So when it comes to practice, there's mainly two things we need to do. There's certain things we need to abandon or give up or refrain from. For example, bad karma, negative actions like killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, telling lies, and so on. So there's certain things to be abandoned, to be given up, to be avoided. So we need to learn about those and then practice them. Try to, even if we can't do it all perfectly, we might be able to give up killing. But when it comes to lying and idle talk, that's quite hard. But we just do our best. We do as much as we can. And gradually, as time goes on, we can give up more and more of the unwholesome or non-virtuous actions. And we also need to give up the afflictive emotions in our mind. That's more difficult. It's easier to stop saying harsh words from our mouth, but to stop having harsh thoughts in our mind is very difficult. I don't know, they just keep popping up all the time. But that too can be transformed. So we just do what we can to work on the afflictive thoughts and emotions in our mind, like our attachment, our anger, and so forth. So there's certain things that we need to give up, to abandon, to overcome. Then the other side is things to be practiced. So there are certain things we need to do, and that would be like virtuous actions. Okay, so we learn about what actions are virtuous, like giving and saving life whenever we can. If we have an opportunity to rescue a sentient being from dying, from being killed or harmed, we can do that. And being generous, of course, giving donations of food and clothes and medicine, and also giving our time. Yeah, that's also a kind of giving. Somebody's lonely or depressed or anxious, worried, frightened, just giving our time to talk to that person and comfort them to the best of our ability. So good actions, virtuous actions. So we learn about those and we try to put those into practice as much as we can. Being kind, loving, caring, cultivating other positive qualities, positive states of mind, wisdom, and so on. So that's kind of basically what it means to practice Buddhism. Certain things to be abandoned, to be refrained from, to be overcome, and other things to be practiced. Okay, so that's the right view, the first of the Eightfold Path. So that's something we can work on. That's something we can start to do. Even if you're busy, you have a job, you have a family, but even just 5 minutes a day of trying to learn more about Buddhist teachings and what it means to follow the Buddhist path, and then just trying to implement those teachings in your life to the best of your ability. And the second is right intention. Sometimes it's also called right thought. So that has to do with our thoughts, our attitudes, our motivations. So basically, we try to keep our thoughts positive as much as we can and not have negative thoughts, negative intentions, such as mainly harmfulness. The Dalai Lama talks a lot about that. He says he really values this ancient Indian idea of ahimsa, of nonviolence. And so just trying to live our life in a non-violent, non-harmful way. Starting with the gross forms of that, like not killing, not doing anything harmful with our body, but then also with our speech, trying not to speak in ways that are harmful and hurtful to others, that cause problems for others. And then even with our mind, with our thoughts, trying to have non-violent thoughts, trying to refrain from negative thoughts, harmful thoughts towards others. And replace these negative ones with positive ones, really trying to cultivate. We all do have loving kindness. We're able to have loving kindness for certain people, like our parents and family members and friends and pets. So trying to extend that feeling of loving kindness to more and more and more people, even to strangers, to neighbors, strangers in the street. And then gradually, even the people we find difficult, difficult to like, and so on. So trying to increase these attitudes of loving kindness and compassion and patience and forgiveness and so on and so forth. So right intention mainly has to do with our thoughts, trying to make our thoughts and our attitudes free of negative ones, harmful ones, and to have more and more positive ones. And then the third of the Eightfold Path is right speech. And so this involves basically refraining from the four forms of non-virtuous speech, four kinds of speech that are non-virtuous: lying, speaking untruths, not telling the truth and saying things that are opposite to the truth. Harsh speech, that's saying hurtful words to others, things that hurt their feelings, even if it's true. Doesn't mean we have to say it. If somebody has some disability or some physical unattractiveness, you don't have to point that out. You don't have to say something about that, even if it's there, because it can be very hurtful for the person. So just trying to refrain from harsh, hurtful words to others. And that can also include swearing. It's not always mentioned, but in some places I've seen, in English we have the so-called four-letter words that some people, it just comes out of their mouth almost like, I don't know if they're even aware of what they're saying sometimes with these nasty words. But yeah, they can be upsetting to people. They upset people. People don't like hearing those words, so better to avoid them. So I think every language has that kind of vocabulary, those kinds of words that are considered impolite, dirty. So just trying to avoid those words. And okay, I'll go through the four. And then divisive speech. So that's speaking in ways that cause division between people. Two people who are friends with each other, or they could be two groups of people, two families, two communities, two nations. If you speak in a way that causes those two parties to be in conflict with each other, to have anger, mistrust, and maybe even start fighting with each other, that's divisive speech. And it's also the case that even if those two parties are already at odds, already in conflict, but you make it worse. You kind of throw kerosene on the fire. You make them even more angry at each other, and more conflicted with each other. So that's divisive speech. So trying to avoid that. And then the fourth one, sometimes it's called gossip, but I prefer the term idle talk, idle speech, because gossip usually is just about people. I'm talking about who's going with who and who's divorced from who and who's having this kind of problem and da 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 da. So talking about people behind their backs. And I'm just going to clear up this fuzziness. I think I get too close to the camera and it gets fuzzy. Yeah, but it's not just about people. Idle talk can also be talking about food, clothes, fashions, football, sports, politics, just probably 99% of what people usually talk about. Kind of conversations that we get into with people. A lot of it isn't very meaningful. So try, the reason this is considered harmful or non-virtuous is because we tend to spend a lot of time doing it, and it's not useful. It's not a wise way of spending our time when there's so many other things we could do that are much more beneficial, like meditation and study and practice. And but it can also, another problem with this, it can increase afflictions. So we're talking about people behind their back, for example, that can cause the people involved in the conversation to have more aversion and mistrust and negative thoughts, or more attachment. When we're talking about food, for example, or about movies or music, it can increase attachment, desire for those things. So it's conversation that can increase afflictive states of mind, delusions, rather than decreasing them. So sometimes we have to get involved in this kind of conversation when we're with family and friends, and they're not Buddhists, they're not Dharma practitioners, and so we can't talk with them about Dharma. They'll just get bored or even angry. So sometimes we might have to spend a certain amount of time talking about these kind of topics with people, but just try to do it as little as possible. Try to cut down as much as possible. So those are the 4 types of unhealthy speech we should try to avoid. And then, right speech also means doing the opposite to those. So being truthful instead of lying, speaking sweetly, saying pleasant words and complimentary words to people rather than harsh speech. And then speaking in ways that bring harmony and good feelings between people, between groups of people, rather than divisive speech. And then speaking meaningful words, saying things that are meaningful and beneficial, rather than just useless, idle words. So giving up the 4 non-virtuous ones and trying to do the 4 virtuous ones as much as we can. So this is something we can at least work on in our lives, even if we can't do it perfectly. But just trying to be aware of our speech, what's coming out of our mouth. And it's good to not be too impulsive. Sometimes if we don't think before we speak, then these kind of words can come out of our mouth, and then once they're out, ooh, we can apologize, but we probably hurt somebody or upset somebody or cause some problems. So it's good to try to be really careful about our speech. Try to refrain from the non-virtuous and try to do the virtuous ones. And then the 4th is right actions. So that has to do with our physical body. We try to refrain from the 3 non-virtuous actions of body: killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, any kind of sexual behavior that causes suffering, causes problems. So we try to refrain from those 3. And just by that itself, just by refraining from those 3, that's already virtuous. That's already right action. But we can also do opposite to those 3, such as saving lives. So often there'll be an insect or an animal that's in danger of being stepped on or run over by a car, or it fell into some water and it's, kind of drowning, and you can rescue it and save it. So that's the opposite of killing, saving a life. So there are often opportunities to do that. And then opposite to stealing would be giving. Even if it doesn't have to be a lot, even just to give, a small amount of money or a small amount of food to a person or a living being that's hungry. Giving offerings to the three jewels and spiritual teachers and so on. So those are opposite to stealing. And then opposite to sexual misconduct would be using our using our body basically, and any kind of sexual inclinations that we may have in ways that are beneficial, not harmful. Being more loving rather than lustful, loving and caring towards other people, and yeah, refraining from any kind of sexual behavior that leads to suffering and problems. And the fifth of the eightfold path is right livelihood. So this has to do with our occupation, our job. And we try to choose a livelihood that's legal, not illegal, that's ethical, not unethical, and that's non-harmful as much as possible. So the Buddha mentioned 5 types of occupation that we should try to avoid. Trading in weapons, like producing or selling weapons, like guns. Number 2, trading in animals for slaughter, like working in a slaughterhouse or raising animals that are sold to a slaughterhouse. Number 3 is slavery. So that still exists in some places in the world. And also prostitution is a kind of slavery in many, many countries. Women or even young girls are kidnapped and then they're kept pretty much like slaves, and they have no freedom at all, and they're forced to work as prostitutes. So just staying completely away from any kind of ways of using human beings in a slavish sort of way. And number 4 is intoxicants. So producing and selling intoxicants, which can include alcohol, but other forms of recreational drugs that can lead to addiction, can lead to many kinds of problems, economic problems, social problems, and so on. So trying to avoid that livelihood. And number 5 is poisons, producing and selling poisons, because those can be used again to cause harm, cause death from other beings. So Buddha said those 5 things should be avoided. And in addition to choosing a livelihood that is ethical and wholesome, while we are working, we should try to behave ethically. We should try to avoid stealing from the company, cheating on our hours, being dishonest about the hours that we work, and so on, and really try our best to be honest, to be sincere, kind-hearted, and hardworking in our livelihood. Okay, number 6, right effort. So right effort means putting our effort into learning the Buddha's teachings and practicing the Buddha's teachings to the best of our ability. And the Buddha taught 4 types of right effort. So the first is to prevent delusions, afflictive states of mind from arising in us. So try to work on not letting our mind have afflictive emotions like anger, attachment, and so on. They're trying to not let them arise in the first place. And the second one is if they do arise, which, we can't just completely stop them. So anger and attachment, when they do arise in our mind, then trying to overcome them using antidotes, doing purification, and so on. So there are things we can do to reduce and purify afflictive emotions when they do arise in our mind. And the third is to develop positive states of mind that have not yet developed. So, increasing our loving kindness, compassion for more and more people and beings that we may not normally feel loving kindness and compassion for. So we're trying to cultivate those positive attitudes towards more and more people, even the difficult ones. And then the fourth is keeping those positive states of mind that have developed from degenerating. So, positive states of mind we already have, such as loving kindness and compassion for certain people, and faith in the Buddha and his teachings. So those are already present in our mind, but we have to make sure that they don't degenerate and disappear. We want to maintain them and increase them as much as we can. So those are 4 areas we can put our effort. And this reminds me of the dedication prayer that we often recite with regard to bodhicitta. May the bodhicitta that has not yet developed be developed. May that which has developed not diminish, but increase more and more. Okay, so that's an example of this kind of thing. Cultivating positive states of mind that haven't yet been developed, and then those who have developed, making sure they don't disappear, but increase them more and more. Okay, then right mindfulness is the number 7. So this mindfulness means paying attention to what we are doing with our body, with our speech, with our mind, and trying our best to keep our body, speech, and mind in a good state, a wholesome, ethical state, and not let our body, speech, and mind go into areas that are unwholesome and non-virtuous and so on. So just keeping watch over our body, speech, and mind, especially our mind, because that's where it all starts from. So I'm kind of rushing a bit because we're running out of time, but you can learn more about these elsewhere. And then the 8th of the Eightfold Path is right concentration. So this means making effort to train our mind to have concentration. It's difficult to do, but we can at least start working on that by practicing meditation, and in our meditation, training our mind to stay focused on the object that we're meditating on, even if it's just a few minutes. So gradually we can go from a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, and then 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, and eventually 10 minutes, and so on. So gradually we can increase the length of time. Right from the beginning, we can't have concentration for long periods of time, but just slowly we can build up and train our mind and concentration. Okay, so that's just a brief look at the four noble truths and the Eightfold Path, and ways in which we can start working on these in our life, and in that way, put into practice these precious teachings that the Buddha gave, starting with his very first teaching, this Dhammacakra Sutra, turning the wheel of Dharma. So there's a few minutes left. If anyone had a question.
Tripti has a question. It's in the chat, Venerable.
Mm-hmm.
Venerable, I wanted to ask, in the past, before we were aware of, the right conduct and how we should behave and how we should think, there are so many things that one has done wrong. What could we do about that?
Okay, yeah. So there's a practice we call purification in the Tibetan tradition. And I'll just briefly mention it, but I'll send more information to Shanti, and she can put it on the website or email it to you or whatever. So the practice of purification involves 4 steps, which are mainly attitudes in the mind, but also some practices we can do. And they're explained in a different order, but I'll explain it the way I find it helpful. The first of the 4 steps is regret. And so regret is a recognition that you did something wrong. Often because of ignorance, you just didn't know any better, you know, when, especially when we're children. I used to kill flies when my mother was cooking, you know, and flies would come into the kitchen. And I thought, oh, they're, you know, I was told they are dirty, they'll make the food dirty, so it's good to kill them. So I used to go around with a fly swatter and kill these flies. So I just didn't know any better, you know. So anyway, later I learned from Buddhism that they are sentient beings too, and it's not good to kill them. So I regretted that action that I did. So that's regret. Regret is, okay, I did that action and now I realize that was not a good thing to do, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I did it. The second step is refuge. It's actually called reliance. The term is reliance. And in Buddhism, what that means is taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, taking the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha as guides that we want to learn from and we want to follow to help us get out of suffering and help us to purify our non-virtues. So just, if you're Buddhist, you've already taken refuge. So it's just remembering our refuge, remembering to rely on the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And this step also involves remembering our attitude of compassion, kindness, non-harmfulness towards other beings, that we want to help them and not harm them in our life. And so kind of renewing that commitment to following a virtuous, non-harmful way of life. And the third step is remedy. That means doing something positive, doing something virtuous to sort of counteract the negative thing that you did. And there's certain practices that are recommended. Some of these might be a little complicated, but you can gradually learn them. One is the practice of Vajrasattva. Vajrasattva is one deity in the Tibetan tradition who's particularly for purification. So you visualize Vajrasattva and recite the Vajrasattva mantra. There's a long version, which has 100 syllables. Takes a while to learn. But there's also a short one, which is just Om Vajrasattva Hum. So before you learn the long one, you can do the short one, Om Vajrasattva Hum. But they also say you can do any mantra, even the Buddha's mantra, Chenrezig mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, Tara's mantra. So taking refuge in any of the Buddha figures, any of the deities, and reciting their mantra, that can be used as this third power of remedy. And there's other things you can do as well, like prostrations, making offerings, doing meditation. So the idea is doing something virtuous, doing something positive to counteract the negative thing that you did. And then the fourth step, fourth power is sometimes it's called promise or resolution. So there you make a promise that you will not do that action again. So if it's something like killing, you might be able to promise, I will never kill again. I will never again kill another living being. But with something like lying or getting angry, you couldn't not do that again. You can't promise, I will never do that again, because you most certainly will break such a promise. So you can make a promise for a short amount of time, even 1 hour or 1 day. You can say, I will not do that again the rest of the day. And then gradually you get used to not doing that non-virtuous action, and then you can extend your promise for longer periods of time and eventually get to where you never do it again. But you have to have some intention to not just go out and do that same action again. So yeah, I in my book, How to Meditate, the new version, which may not be available in India, but there is a whole section about the 4 powers of purification and what they mean and how to do them. So I can send a file of that to Shanti and she can share it with you. Is that okay, Shanti? Okay.
Thank you so much.
This is a very, very important practice in the Tibetan tradition. Most people who follow the Tibetan tradition will do a practice of purification on a daily basis. It's like a daily practice that we do, because every day we make mistakes, we do non-virtuous. So it's good to kind of clean up our negative actions on a daily basis. Okay, so we've run to the end of our time, run out of our time. So let's conclude with a dedication of merit, positive energy. So by spending this time together looking at the Buddha's first teaching, first turning of the wheel of Dharma, what he taught at that time, and then looking at ways that we can start practicing those teachings in our daily life. So this has been a really good thing to do, especially starting with an altruistic intention, doing this not just for ourselves, but for the benefit of all living beings. So we've definitely created merit, positive energy. So now let's share this merit with all living beings, wishing that it will bring them peace and happiness, freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering, wishing that they will learn these teachings as well so that they can do the things they need to do in order to achieve freedom from suffering and eventual liberation and full enlightenment. So may the merit we've created be a contribution to that, to the liberation and enlightenment of all living beings. And also we can dedicate for the long lives of our spiritual teachers whose presence in the world is so important to teach us the Dharma and to serve as role models on how to live the Dharma, how to practice the Dharma. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and all other spiritual teachers. May they remain in good health and remain with us as long as possible. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you
was
all.
so
Thank you,
valuable.
Venerable.
Thank you for
Happy Chokhor Duchen, everyone.
Thank you. Thank
Happy
you, everyone.